Hello, friends of the IACL blog, and welcome to another video interview. My name's Julian Murphy. I'm one of the assistant editors, and I'm based at the Melbourne Law School in Melbourne, Australia. And we're delighted today to be joined by Dr. Myriam Hunter-Henin, who has recently published Why Religious Freedom Matters for Democracy, Comparative Reflections from Britain and France for a Democratic Vivre Ensemble with Heart this year. Welcome, Dr. Hunter-Henin. Can you tell us a little bit about the book?
Thank you. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. And thank you, Julian, for this kind introduction. And thank you for the International Association of Constitutional Law first for organizing this interview. In a nutshell, I would say that the book is about the importance of religious freedom in law, importance not only as a negative liberty in order to protect believers from intrusions and interferences, but also as a positive value for society to support pluralism and equality and thereby enrich democracy.
Fantastic. There's a lot in there. Could you tell us a little bit about the title? I'm particularly interested, for those of us that might not speak French, in the subtitle, Comparative Reflections from Britain and France for a Democratic Vivre Ensemble.
Very mysterious title. Well, the first part, the main title, Why Religious Freedom Matters for Democracy, is a response to the growing dichotomous discourse which presents religious freedom and democracy as competitive forces. By contrast, the book argues that the pluralism that religious freedom brings is beneficial and enriching for democracy. And here comes the second part, the subtitle, Vivre Ensemble, literally living together. I argue that construed in an inclusive way, religious freedom can foster a living together which is harmonious. So democracy here is not construed as a process of majoritarian parliamentary decision-making, but as an open-ended reason-giving and inclusive process of deliberation.
Thank you. Well, that's really illuminating. And most importantly, I think the title has definitely made us all really want to read the book. So thank you. Next, I wanted to ask you, in a nutshell, how would you describe your democratic approach in the book?
So the full argument is based on a political philosophy discussion. But in a nutshell, I would say that the democratic approach, as I call it, is based on three criteria of avoidance, inclusion, and revision. Under the method of avoidance, a term coined by Stephen Holmes, the state is to refrain from interfering with religious beliefs. Such non-interference, however, will cease to be justified if, as I show, systemic disadvantage works against certain minority groups and vulnerable members of society. That is why the principle of inclusion comes in. And under that principle, the state is to step in when need be to ensure that minority marginalized voices can be heard on an equal footing. And finally, according to the third feature, the principle of revision, both citizens and state institutions are expected to revise their commitments in order to preserve the ever-renewed and revisited horizon of this Vivre Ensemble.
Thank you. Thank you for outlining that really dense but really helpful theoretical framework. I was wondering if, sort of in addition to that, whether you had anything else to say about the sort of methodology of the book, the methodology of your work?
Yes, I think the novelty of the book in part lies in its original methodology, in the blend of a theoretical and comparative analysis itself framed in historical sociological terms and complemented by legal analysis of relevant case studies.
What lessons do you think emerged for comparative law from the process of writing the book, and in particular, what's been produced in the book?
I think that compared to comparative work on law and religion, which still often reasons in terms of abstract constitutional models, my investigations revealed that the reality is far more complex and never as fixed. So whilst I argue, for example, that church establishment in England, just like French secularism, the French concept of laïcité, but via different routes, is amenable to religious pluralism, I also prove that in both jurisdictions, exclusionary trends are at play and are sadly on the increase.
Thank you. Thank you. Could you say a little bit more, if you can, about the sort of structure of the book and how you structured the project and your demonstration of it?
I will. Maybe should I mention the contribution to political philosophy as well?
Yes, right.
Because there are also two elements. So the theoretical chapter, the core main chapter, dived into a political philosophy literature. And in political philosophy, the terms of the debate on religious freedom and democracy are mainly framed as an alternative between what I have called the accommodationist view and the analogous to secular view. Contrary to such alternatives, the book offers, I think, a third way. So very briefly, against accommodationists who would allow religious citizens and religious communities to opt out altogether from general laws and obligations, I argue for a democratic vivre ensemble based on reciprocity, a shared space, if you will, in which religious freedoms are conceived as positive rights of participation, but come with limits attached. On the other hand, against those liberals under the analogous to secular approach who would dissolve, disaggregate, and in the end dilute, I think, religious freedoms into underlying secular values, I argue that the category of religious freedom matters in law to ensure that legal reasoning itself is open to diversity. But let me go back then to your question about structure. I think it was one of the challenges of the book to combine the three threads of comparative perspective, legal analysis, and political philosophy argument. One of the assumptions of current trends is that contemporary religious requests go against national constitutional principles and traditions. So my first step was to test this assumption. And I did that through an interdisciplinary analysis of each national story I had selected of the relationships between religious freedom, pluralism, and law. Having proven through this interdisciplinary sociological and historical analysis that an inclusive approach to religious freedom was possible in each jurisdiction, but via different ways, I moved on to arguing that a pluralism-friendly approach, my democratic approach, was not only possible, but also desirable. And finally, in part 2 of the book, I revert to context and explore legal controversies of religious freedom and test my democratic approach before interesting court cases, choosing the employment sphere as an area of investigation.
Thank you. I think we're really getting a really rich picture now of just how much the book is trying to do with all of those legal, comparative, and political, philosophical insights and perspectives. Perhaps, can you now talk about, you mentioned just at the end of that answer, the cases and the employment law context you were talking about. what lessons emerged, if any, for judges and courts from your study?
Indeed, in recent years, there have been many and increasing delicate questions reaching the courts. To give you a few examples, the courts have had to grapple with questions such as whether an employee should be allowed to wear a religious symbol at work, whether a religious employer should be allowed to impose constraints on employees' private lives for the sake of enforcing a religious work ethos, whether an employee or service provider should be allowed on religious grounds to be exempt from working with customers of the opposite sex or of a same-sex sexual orientation. Whilst the principle of revision I advocate under the democratic approach postulates that precise outcomes must depend on contextual evolving deliberations, guidelines nonetheless emerged for courts. So I don't have time to go into the cases, which would be fascinating, but let me say that the method of avoidance and principle of inclusion combine under my approach to dictate, for example, that courts do not determine in advance which religious practices amount to acceptable manifestations, but take on board the claimant's interest in expressing her religious faith, however conspicuous or inconsistent the manifestation may appear at first sight. And the democratic approach will also lead courts to scrutinizing the competing interests at play in the workplace without deferring blankly to the employers or to national courts' own assessment of the tensions if supranational courts are the ones examining the case.
Fantastic, thank you. And last, it's a big question, but what do you see as the book's contribution to academic discourse and to constitutional or public law more generally?
Yes, a big question. Well, my book obviously is a contribution to our thinking and to delicate cases on and about religious freedom, but it also contributes to constitutional law scholarship in many other ways. It adds to debates on theories of democracy, constitutionalism within and beyond the state, judicial review, constitutional identity, doctrine, and populism. As for the contribution to academic discourse and legal reasoning more generally, my strongest wish, and it's a nice way to conclude, I think, would be for the book to help resist the current identitarian impulse and encourage instead a more discursive approach, more open to dialogue, deliberation, and self-revision.
Thank you so much, and thanks for talking to us today about the book. It sounds like a really exciting project. I know I'm looking forward to reading it, and I'm sure lots of the IACL blog readers are as well. So thank you very much, Dr. Hunter-Henin. And we've been talking today about Dr. Hunter-Henin's recent book, Why Religious Freedom Matters for Democracy, Comparative Reflections from Britain and France for a Democratic Vivre Ensemble, published by Heart this year, 2020. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.